Our new camp was intended for the whole of the 1st Regiment. It was situated on the slope of one of the small hills which, in this land not rich in uplands, were called the Upt Mountains. But they were only hills, smooth, sloping slopes, with cheerful streams running down them. Poor Australia, nature had not been very generous to her. There were no rivers in our sense of the word, only streams, and one of them flowed at the foot of the hill on which the tent camp was set up. Of course it rained and was very muddy. The food was an unappetizing slop of mutton and undercooked vegetable. The fuel was a supply of wood for a stove set up in the centre of each tent. There was little opportunity for recreation, only occasional leave at the end of the week, and a small eatery about 1.5 miles down the road that served the most unaged and disgusting-tasting beer I had ever tasted. It was also served in cups, in a room for 20 people, which was always packed with at least 200 people. Weeks followed each other, similar to 2 peas in a pod of night marches, daytime training in the field just like New River, only more boring, even annoying. Because after Guadalcanal we were capable of more. Sometimes we were given a handful of rice, or the equivalent of a Japanese soldier's ration, and ordered to make a 50-kilometre night. March, followed by a day's sleep. I remember once during such a sleep in a field I was awakened by a huge cow, with sad eyes that looked at me with mute reproach for having settled on the juiciest and sweetest grass. We had night's training had taught us another lesson. We had learned that if the map and compass fell into the hands of our junior lieutenant, we should expect trouble. Gradually, not too noticeably, discipline was tightened, as a coachman slowly and smoothly pulls the reins. But then came an abrupt halt as the troops regrouped. Sergeant Macharmony became a staff sergeant in Company N. He was a skinny, short man, barely tall enough to be a Marine, an uncommonly profane and sadistic man. If he did not become a monster with such qualities, it was only because of a great sense of humour and intelligence. In the person of Sergeant Charmony, I found my own personal vesture. Within a day or two of his appearance, we realized that we could not get along together. As soon as the next reformation came up, he was glad to get rid of me. That's what I expected when I went with the others on a call to the company headquarters. It was raining, but Sergeant Macharmony ignored the large drops that sealed the liquid strands of hair against his narrow skull. Standing in the rain, surrounded by smugly grinning platoon sergeants, he broadcast with undisguised joy. All right then, it's settled. This company has suffered enough because of a few knuckleheads and assholes. Today we'll finally get rid of them. Some of the sergeants covered their grinning mouths with their hands. They were clearly enjoying themselves. There was no doubt that there was only one person on the asshole list, McDamage. I can only offer my condolences to the companies where they're going, he said. But we can't all suffer. As soon as I have read the list, the following persons are to return to their squadrons, gather their belongings, and line up at the headquarters tent. Calling each name, McNusty grinned contentedly. 1 or 2 of the sergeants were already laughing openly. Their perverse joy was spilling over, growing wider, gaining momentum. The sergeant's laughter was neither hearty nor sincere. It was gloating, for every name meant disgrace to the man, the breaking of bonds of friendship formed at Pan's Island and New River, and tested on Guadalcanal. Any name meant the loss of something immeasurably important, perhaps difficult to feel immediately. But nevertheless the process is happening and is irreversible. Like a river slowly, imperceptibly at first, washes away handful after handful of earth from the shore and carries it with the current to the sea. He called my name. There was another burst of laughter, and I, saddened beyond measure, went to pack my things. Goodbye, Chuckles, Big Boy and Runner. Goodbye, Company N. I felt lonely and lost. I walked and cried my eyes out. Thank God it was mercifully raining, so I could keep my head down low and pull my helmet over my eyes as if I wanted to protect my face from the rain. I ducked into the tent and packed up my gear. The first shock had passed, and now resentment and humiliation, undeserved in my opinion, joined the grief, and I began to hate Sergeant Macharmonius with a sharp, persistent, unforgiving, never forgetting hatred. My hands longed to clasp around his neck. I longed to be alone with him in his tent. Hate burned and devastated me, and even if God himself had commanded me to love this man, I couldn't do it. I packed my things and left the tent. The rain continued to fall. Back to the staff tent I returned fairly quickly. The crowd had slowly dispersed. The only people standing in the rain were my fellow soldiers, like me, hiding their faces under their helmets. They stood with their heads down and slouched, as if the weight of shame were bending them to the ground. From the headquarters tent we could hear the hum of voices, against which the quavering laughter of McNasty was distinctly distinguished. We stood in the rain until a sergeant from Company E. He looked at us blankly and disappeared into the tent, whence he reappeared with our papers in his hand. Hastily hiding them under his cloak, he stopped directly in front of us, looked at each of us carefully, and shrugged his shoulders. "Listen to my command," he bellowed. "Fall in. To the right. Forward march." And we marched towards the unknown. The transferred soldiers were constantly moving between different companies of the battalion. This was probably because the commanders considered the reorganization a great opportunity to put an end to old family squabbles. In this confusion, I began to find respite. I decided to let the matter rest, but to begin with, I was going to have a good time. My plan was intricate and complex. It was based on 3 events of the morning. I woke up with red-scarred hands. The gunnery sergeant of a company, True Matka, had mistaken me for my buddy Broad Smile, who had transferred with me, and in a few hours a company was to go on a week-long field firing exercise. Broad Smile was supposed to stay behind to collect firewood. I found that out from the artilleryman, but nobody told him anything. I got Wide Smile to agree to go to the field and respond to my name at the morning check for 2 days. I told him that when Sergeant True Matka came to identify me at logging, thinking I was Broad Smile, I would tell him who I really was and explain that Broad Smile had departed for the field. I will also tell him that I have received orders to go to the hospital for treatment of hives. Broad Smile, after 2 days, was to say who he really was and express his bewilderment at the fact that his name was not called at the morning roll call. He also had to say he didn't know me. I hoped that the top sergeant, upon discovering my absence, would not put me on the AWOL list until he had determined the exact date of my disappearance. He would not want to admit to the master sergeant or company commander that he had listed an absent person as present. He'll wait until he gets back to camp to give me a hard interrogation, and I'll take him to the cannon. The chance was slim, but I desperately wanted to be away from the unfamiliar, unfriendly faces of my new comrades for at least a little while. Wide Smile thought the plan was a failure. "Well," he said, "I wouldn't mess with it if I were you, but if you want to, that's fine." The company departed for its destination. I was lying on a bunk in a tent, and I could hear Sergeant Pravda Matka yelling in a drunken bass, rallying men for the logging. I heard him shout Broad Smile's last name twice and snorted indignantly when I heard silence in response. Then True Matka issued brief instructions to the assembled men and began looking for Wide Smile. I looked out and saw him stagger from tent to tent, pulling back the tent flap at each, peering inside, and putting it back in place. He was a few more tents away from mine when I carefully lowered the tent flap and lay down on the bunk. A ray of light, falling on my face, announced that True Matka was at the entrance to the tent. I closed my eyes. "What the hell are you doing here?" I opened my eyes, feigned surprise, jumped up and timidly glanced at him. "Are you Big Smile?" I shook my head silently. "No. Who are you?" "Lucky," I replied. "I'm a transfer from Company H." "I know," he mumbled, and pulled a greasy notebook out of his pocket. I don't know what he was looking for in it, but after a few minutes he was staring at me again. "Do you know Broad Smile?" "I do." "Have you seen him?" "Yeah, he's gone shooting with the 2nd Squad." She cursed irritably. His breath smelled of aqua velva. Sergeant True Matka was known in the battalion for his fondness for aftershave. He must have drained a bottle this morning. Then he gave me an angry look. "What the devil are you doing hanging around here?" "Shouldn't you be out shooting?" "No," I replied and rolled up my sleeves. "I have hives. I've been told to go to the hospital." Pravda Matka took one look at the red welts and instantly retreated. To the old man there is nothing more horrible than skin diseases and any manifestation of human uncleanliness, because these people have lived their lives in large collectives and have seen with their own eyes how epidemics spread. It seems to them that any such diseases are contagious, so he asked no questions and hurried away from me. I got dressed, gathered my clothes into a bag and lay down again. At noon, when the foresters had gone to lunch, I went down the slope, walked around the camp from the rear where there were no sentries, took a bus to Dundee Pop Station, and thence a train to Melbourne. There I spent 4 delightful days at my friend's house, and only returned to camp on the 5th day on Friday. It was the day for the issuance of the allowance. Not far from the headquarters tent was a table at which sat the company commander, who gave us the money after we had signed the payrolls. So, growled Sergeant Pravdematka, staring at the form. You line up in alphabetical order, regardless of rank, first cadres, then reservists. Sign with your full name, including junior if necessary. I got a warning. Sergeant True Matka shouted my last name, looking at the book as if it were his personal enemy. I stepped forward, signed my name on the ledger. The company commander gave me a calm, appraising look and paid me off. I took a breath and turned to get out of sight, but I didn't. An iron hand slammed into my shoulder. Are you lucky? It was True Mother. Yeah. Grab your ass and get it to the staff tent. His breath smelled of Elqua Velva, as usual, and I thought as I walked to the staff tent that today, payday, there would probably be no aftershave left in the commissary by tonight, and I also thought that I had not yet had to deal with the top sergeant of a company. His anger wasn't too convincing, so I decided, standing in front of the man sitting behind the desk. He didn't look denuded or tough. His calloused face, with its large nose and big, beautiful eyes, looked about 30 years old, a good age for a top Marine Corps sergeant. You're going to have to stay here a while, he informed him. But why? And you have the nerve to ask. For all. He looked at me sternly and said, Where have you been? I was silent, trying to hold back the desperate beating of my heart. I hoped that Wide Smile had said my name at least once at roll call. One time was enough to confuse things. Where have you been? He asked, lowering his tone a little. So, at the shooting, I reported. Don't lie, he frowned indignantly. We know you weren't there. We also know what you told the sergeant. Were you in town? Silence. Look, he began conciliatorily, and there was no more irritation in his voice, only conviction, even flattery. I know what happened. I know you didn't get along with Macharmony. You needed to think about it, and you went away for a few days. Perhaps even I understand and don't blame you, perhaps. Why don't you admit your guilt and let me talk to the captain? He won't be too hard on you. Don't do anything stupid. You could hurt yourself big time. This kind of treatment is the hardest thing to resist. It's easier when you're being yelled at and stomped on, but I held on with all my might and kept silent. It was obvious that the top sergeant was slowly beginning to lose patience, and finally I broke the silence. Who's accusing me? Go to your tent and wait, he barked. And I went to my tent. I had every reason to rejoice. Wide Smile must have covered for me, though of course the sergeant had no particular desire to take me to the battalion commander, and that could only be because he didn't want to admit that he had been counting me as present for days when in reality I had been AWOL. My plan had worked. I sat in the tent and waited. An hour later a messenger showed up. Can you type? When he saw me again he was curious. Yes. Oh, would you like to be company clerk? Who would blame me for smiling? At last. It's a cakewalk. Of course, I agreed, and 3 days later the top came down with a severe attack of malaria, and I became the acting sergeant of company year. It was a dull job, scarcely less tedious than the duties of company clerk, which I took up when the top returned from the hospital, the 10 days in charge of company. It passed without incident, save that I was offered a bribe of £2 by one of the soldiers to be relieved from guard duty at the end of the week. I refused the bribe, but made him spend the sum on Crestfallen, Biggie, Runner, and the rest when we met one night in our diner. All in all, my miraculous transformation from culprit to boss was accompanied only by outward comfort. In my heart, I continued to feel discomfort, and therefore took the opportunity to transfer to the battalion intelligence. In battalion intelligence. It was called B2 Served Artist. We were on Piraeus Island together. He transferred here from Company G, having distinguished himself at the Battle of Tiparu, where a Japanese wounded him in the leg with a bayonet. Shortly after the top was returned, the artist spoke to me in the street. With him was Lieutenant Big Kino, the battalion's intelligence officer. There he is, said the artist to the lieutenant and waved to me. I told you exactly about him. After that, he introduced me to the officer in full uniform. I heard you worked at the newspaper, said Big Kino. I nodded. How would you feel about starting a battalion newspaper? I enthused, and so my short but eventful career in the company came to an end. While I was there, I never once had to pick up a rifle. Of course, I never got around to publishing a battalion newspaper either. It was just another in a series of grandiose big movie ideas. That's how he flattered his vanity. There were no newspapers in the regiment and division, but Big Kino could brag at every opportunity that he had a potential editor in intelligence. I don't rule out that he liked to take wishful thinking for reality. In any case, Big Kino saved me from the dreary fate of being an errand boy at Company E headquarters, got me back on track, and healed the pride that Macharmony had deeply wounded. I'm also very grateful to Big Kino for overlooking my reputation as a rebel, and even the fact that I was a veteran ship rat by then. I'd heard General Smedley Butler fond of saying, "Give me a regiment of ship rats, and I'll conquer the world." Though perhaps the old man never said that. But he may well have said it, or if not him, some other Marine commander. It is the Marine Corps that has attitudes which, if carefully analysed and passed, may seem shameless and even shocking. But that is the case. A man who comes ashore from a ship must be bold, perhaps bordering on insolence and he can and must periodically rebel against the rigid discipline of the camp. I am not trying to exalt what should be punished for, nor am I suggesting at all that ship rats escape deserve punishment because of their insolence or independence. The guilty should be punished. They were, are, and will be. And I am not talking about the usual inhabitants of the brig. Pathological lazy, unfit simulants who spend more time in the brig than out of its walls and try their best to avoid any consequences of wearing a uniform, and especially of fighting. I'm talking about a young, hot-headed guy whose free-loving nature can't help but bring him into conflict with military discipline, and thus, unless he's exceptionally lucky, of course, straight to the brig. I'm talking about Crestfallen, Chicken, Stump, and a dozen others, and, of course, myself. On George Washington's birthday, Hu Hotun and I sullied our clean reputation. The division was to parade through Melbourne that day. We were to march in formation down Swanston Street, a month after arriving in Australia to receive the gratitude of a city and a nation still mindful of the Japanese threat that existed on Guadalcanal. But Ho Hotun, I didn't feel like typing a step on the sidewalk. We were eager to see the parade, which, as you well realise, is impossible for the man taking part in it, with his rifle glued to his shoulder and his gaze directed strictly forward, into the back of the head of the man walking ahead. By a series of complicated and clever tricks, we managed to avoid this most unpleasant duty. So when the 1st Marine Division marched down Melbourne's main street on February 22, 1943, we were comfortably seated not far from the City Club building with bottles in our hands. All around us were the excited, joyous cheers of Australians greeting our comrades. A hooray for the Americans! Well done, lads! Hooray! The soldiers were dressed in field uniforms and were marching in full battle dress. Rifles on their shoulders, bayonets fixed. Each carried the weapon that was his in battle. They made an impressive impression. Strong, fit, determined, tanned. Guys like that are capable of a lot. Looking at them, I felt my eyes moisten. Even the Australians, who had inherited the British enthusiasm for the clicking of heels, the clang of guns, the stampede, and other outward effects, finally fell silent as they watched the silent march of the 1st Marine Division, marching with the light yet weary step of soldiers heading for the front. Hothun saw the red and yellow banner of our regiment flying. We hastily retreated from our seats from the first row of spectators farther away to the 3rd or 4th. The 1st Battalion passed, followed by ours, and we felt our breath quicken uncontrollably. Company E, Company F, and finally our Company H. There they all were, big boy and runner, Lieutenant Ivy, gentlemen, Amish, all of them. How could I not be proud? It's the kind of thing you remember for a lifetime. It was beautiful, exciting, intoxicating. It must be something similar to reading your own obituary or attending your own funeral. They were so proud, so confident, and the eyes of the Australians watching them were full of admiration. A great day. We hoped it would never end, but it did come to an end, and we had no choice but to replace that rare, true intoxication with the artificial intoxication that is so easy to maintain if you have a sufficient supply of liquor. After enjoying the action, we turned around and headed back to the City Club. And of course we drank too much. By nightfall, we crawled out into the fresh air. Hotun was supposed to be on guard duty at our diner that night, so he left, swaying quite a bit. I was sure that by the time he got to the stadium, the intoxication would have worn off and he would be walking smoothly. After a while, I too returned to camp, but I'll be honest, I was just lucky here, or my guardian angel decided to work. I ran for the bus, jumped onto the platform, missed, grabbed the handrail, and was dragged for 2 blocks until 2 burly Australians dragged me inside like a drowning man. Struggling desperately, I managed to straighten up and proudly stuck out my chest. So what, I said, I got hit last night and nothing. Laughter followed me to my stop. I saw Chucklehead grumpily shuffling from foot to foot at the entrance to the diner. He was hoping to take up a post inside so he could have a mug or 2 of beer while he was on duty. "I'll get you one," I promised. First I brought a mug, then another, a third, and seemingly a few more. Then this, "I have to go to the restroom. Stay a little while for me." He gave me a gun belt and a helmet and walked away with an unsteady gait. Getting drunk at a post, then leaving it, leaving your weapon behind, is an unforgivable sin, a crime for a century. I sincerely hoped he would hurry up, but we were out of luck. Lieutenant Ivy walked by, as luck would have it. I said we were unlucky because Ivy was the officer on duty that day. Moreover, he was and still was the man who pocketed my cigars, our cigars, if you will. My anger, fueled by alcohol, knew no bounds. I pulled out my crestfallen pistol, pointed it at the lieutenant, and "Stay where you are, you miserable cigar thief, you son of a bitch, or I'll blow your gentlemanly ass off." To this I added a few other very unliterary words and expressions. However, no matter the phraseology, a loaded gun commands a lot of respect. Lieutenant Ivy retreated, but returned almost immediately with reinforcements in the form of Corporal Gladkolikshiko and a sergeant from the guardhouse. While Ivy distracted me with conversation, Gladkoliko and the sergeant crept up from the rear. Then they rushed forward and I, understandably, did not win. I "Surrender your weapons," ordered Ivy, pale with anger, "and find that idiot Hotun at once." There was no need to look for him. He was already hurrying to his post, but, alas, he was too late. Ivy ordered him to be taken into custody. Then, trembling with rage, clenching and unclenching his fists and moving his jaws involuntarily, I thought I could hear his joints crunching, he came toward me. "No, take him away!" The smooth-faced man led us away. Suddenly, as we approached the brig, we got a reprieve. "Go to your places," and said. "The lieutenant will deal with you in the morning." He shook his head reproachfully and stared hard at me. "You've done a hell of a thing today, slutty. Trying to shoot an officer. I know a guy who got 10 years just for hitting an officer. I woke up this morning to someone shaking me roughly by the shoulder. It was the sergeant who had picked me up the night before. Get dressed now. Full uniform, you're going on the carpet." He stood nearby and watched grimly as I hastily pulled on my underwear and green uniform. Maybe the sergeant's gloom was only outward, but it made me cold inside. I now realized clearly what I had done the night before. 20 years hard labor was not a very severe punishment for assaulting an officer on duty. Cold and imperturbable, the battalion master sergeant was waiting for us at the door of the colonel's office, tall with sharp features, thinning wheaten hair, and a moustache. He looked more like a Scots guardsman than an American Marine. "The prisoner," he said, looking through me, and ignoring the look of horror on my face at the word, enters the colonel's office only on my command. When commanded to stop, he stands at attention in front of the colonel and remains in that position until he is released. "Prisoner, attention. Forward march. Prisoner, halt." My eyes were fixed on the smooth, round face of our battalion commander, Mr. 515. Mr. 595 was nicknamed for his build. He was 5 feet tall, or a little more, and as tall as he was wide. The nickname was given with affection. We were good to the commander. At least we were on Guadalcanal, when not a day went by that we didn't see Mr. 595 scurrying around the positions, checking on the men. The master sergeant read out the charges, which, even though brief and severe in military style, sounded very impressive. When he finished, the colonel looked intently through me as if my stomach was completely transparent. "Lieutenant, let's hear your version of what happened." Ivy was standing behind me, so his voice came from behind me. He spoke, and the colonel continued to stare at me. I was surprised to note that the lieutenant's voice was strained, as if he, too, was embarrassed in front of the colonel or was doing what he had been ordered to do. Recounting the night's events, under compulsion, he told the truth, including the most important fact that I was absolutely drunk. In this case, drunkenness was a mitigating circumstance. It would have been worse if I had done such a thing sober. The colonel looked at me long and hard. I stared straight ahead, trying not to swallow, not to move, not to blink, and to keep my tongue moist, so that when I was asked a question I could answer quickly and clearly. I also tried hard not to lose heart completely. The colonel was stern. You could not guess anything from his face. He scrutinized my papers, as if deciding what to believe more, what was written in the papers or the words of Ivy and the chief sergeant. Would he be adamant or would he show mercy? That I could not say. But I knew as well as any other soldier in my position that my future, my life, was now in his hands. I can't say I enjoyed the thought. What can you say? I coughed and swallowed convulsively. Me guilty, sir? He glanced at the papers again, then looked up at me. I will not maim your life, he said, and something in my stomach twisted and churned. For what you've done, I could put you away for a long time. And the fact that you were drunk is no excuse. A Marine has to be able to control his temper under any circumstances. You have done well in the war, he continued, so I will not send you on the nearest ship to Portsmouth, as is my custom. But at the same time, I will not let you get away with such a misdemeanour. His gaze became even more severe. 5 days on bread and water. Demoted to private. The sergeant major spat out the order to go, and I mechanically obeyed, feeling glad to be on my feet. I was so happy that I almost missed the look of extreme annoyance on Ivy's face. He looked at me with the look of a hunter who had lost his game. I think Ivy didn't mean to destroy me either, but still, he would have preferred a harsher punishment. 5 days on bread and water. I don't care if it was 5 years. I was jubilant and could hardly restrain myself from hugging the guard who was waiting to escort me from the colonel's office to the brig. Getting into a Marine Corps brig, especially a cell where prisoners are on bread and water, is almost like going overseas. The first thing you must do is arrive at the infirmary and undergo a medical examination to determine if you are physically healthy enough to endure confinement and diet. The next point of departure is the company headquarters, where your papers are marked with a record of your punishment, as well as a notation that your pay will be cut during the period of confinement. Then you must report to the company, hand over your belongings and weapons to the sergeant in charge of the economic part, and only then, at first in only baggy pants, you are ready for the door of the brig to slam shut behind you. And in the company, you will be considered dead for 5 days. They'll even remove all the bedding from your bunk. You're a zero, a nothing, a naughty boy with his nose in the corner. And in all the above movements you are accompanied by a guard, holding a rifle in front of you, your shadow, your shame. The large black circles drawn on the chest and back of your new robe have a very real physical mass. They are heavy, pulling you to the ground. You feel them every second, and you know they are there specifically to make it easier for the guard to aim if you suddenly decide to break free. The brig takes you in and you finally become nothing. You are no longer a person, you have nothing of your own. Even the suit you were given belongs to the brig. It bears its brand. Absolutely everything. Even shaving blades is not yours. You have nothing, so you are nothing. The iron door of the prison slams shut behind you. What's in store for the next lowlife who gets here? It turns out to be the warden, thoughtfully twirling a piece of rubber hose, and you suddenly realize he's choosing his victim. No one is able to detach the comicality of the situation. A chill rises from the cement floor, and your heart stiffens as you stare like a rabbit at a boa constrictor at the warden, cruelty burning in his eyes. It is cold, very cold. You are one-on-one with the brig warden, dressed in a neat, fitted uniform, and behind him is the United States Marine Corps and the entire United States of America. In reality, behind his shoulders is a door that opens and a gruff voice commands curtly, "Go march." You enter and are given the opportunity to greet your fellow prisoners serving their time on bread and water. I entered a world of shadows, a cave washed into an underwater rock by a deep current. But soon I heard the hum of voices, and the shadows became flesh. I heard laughter, and this gloomy place was illuminated by the strongest light in the world, the light of the human spirit, and I realized that I was not in hell, as I had imagined at first, but only in the brig, for some 5 days. When my eyes got used to the semi-darkness, I realized that I was standing in a room about 6 by 4.5 meters in size, into which light penetrated through the only small window. located very high up. The cement floor, like the walls, had a slight slope towards the centre where the drain for the water was located. In the middle of one of the walls was a fosse with several metal mugs hanging from it. Our cell had been converted from a shower room. I saw the still recently disembodied shadows standing leaning against the stacks, peering at me with curiosity and anticipation. Someone's voice from the darkness questioned, "Why are you here?" I timidly answered. A tense silence followed, which was broken by an indignant shriek. "Are you crazy? What are you going to shoot an officer for?" "He stole my cigars on Guadalcanal." "No. Too bad you didn't shoot the bastard," another voice snorted. "What'd they give you for that?" "Guesses, 5 days on bread and water," I answered honestly. Now they were all talking indignantly at once. They didn't seem to believe me. How did you manage to get away with it? God damn it. I got 30 days just for getting off the hill for a couple days. For what you did, they should have sent you to Portsmouth and stuck your ass in the brig forever. Yeah, come to think of it. You tried to shoot the officer on duty. Your old man must be a general or some other big shot. Suddenly there was a sharp bang on the door. "Hey, you there, knock it off." The loud polyphony immediately changed to a muffled muttering, and then the cell was silent. My eyes were fully accustomed to the low light, and I looked around at my fellow prisoners. There was no one from my company, but there was one fellow from the battalion whom I knew by sight. All the faces had the same expression of grouchy depression characteristic of victims of minor punishments, urban adolescents, or illusionist dilettantes, and it didn't look like anyone was hoping for magical deliverance. Apart from this common facial expression, and apart from the constant lamentation of the officers and sergeants who had put the innocent behind bars, or the fervent but utterly unafraid promises of revenge, there was nothing to distinguish the inhabitants of the brig from the men at large. Here were the same Marines, only in trouble. The shadows were still along the walls. No one was sitting down, and I asked the guy shuffling from foot to foot beside me why. "They're watering the deck," he said, pointing to the floor. It was impossible to sit, unless you wanted to get your ass wet and cold. The floor was still wet when a private entered the cell and began to splash water from buckets onto the floor. Behind him stood another private with a rifle at the ready. "Relax," the shadow next to me whispered. "You'll get used to it. The brig isn't a country club. They always water the floor if they catch someone smoking in here." Smoking?" He nodded, and I tried to follow the direction of his gaze. As soon as the door slammed shut, the two shadows across from us smoked a cigarette butt. To hide the light of the match, which seemed very bright in the darkness, they had erected a kind of tent of 2 jackets over the head of one of them. They took shallow puffs, exhaled the smoke downward, and waved their arms diligently to disperse it. It was a real caricature, which, however, no one found funny. There were muffled cries of displeasure all around, but the smokers ignored them and continued to endanger everyone in the room, taking unparalleled pleasure in the mere fact that they were breaking the rules, because there is no other kind of pleasure to be derived from this way of smoking. Where'd they get the cigarettes? The thing is, the long-termers get a normal meal, a full ration, every 4 days. When they're taken out to eat with the regular prisoners, someone hands them cigarettes. They hide them in their hair or between their fingers, sometimes even in their mouths. But then they have to wait for the tobacco to dry. The door swung open, and I cringed, expecting more water. But it turned out to be mealtime. Chick, chick, chick. One of the guards shouted foolishly, "Chickens, come eat," as he pushed a large wooden box into the room and slammed the door shut. They pounced on it like a pack of hungry wolves. They leaped around the box and tore the loaves of bread with the fury of a mob hungry for the blood of a defeated tyrant. With one silent leap, they swooped at the coveted box, struggled, pulled, shoved, and only when they had snatched the coveted scrap and chewed it greedily, retreated to the steps. There, shrunken like caged animals, they silently chewed their food. Their eyes burned with anger and suspicion, and their postures expressed their determination to defend their peace. Occasionally, one of the shadows would get up and pour a mug of water, or take a pinch of salt scattered carelessly at the bottom of the box. Such was the bread and water diet. This was repeated 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening. I, seeing this scene for the first time, stepped away in horror, and as a result found only a small breadcrumb in the box. After that, I quickly learned to rush forward at the first sound of the guard's mocking voice. Night in the brig begins at once. There is no twilight here. When the last faint ray of light dies, it's pitch black, and you immediately feel how tired you are. The evening bread box has already been brought and emptied. There is nothing else to wait for but the approaching day of liberation. It is better to fall asleep, to forget, to fall into blessed oblivion and wake up one day closer to freedom. The guards came with blankets, but 2 per person, one to lay on the still damp cement, the other to cover themselves. Like Robin Hood's brigands, we laid down on this hard bed and fell asleep at once. We prisoners were luckier than the jailers. While we slept, there would be a guard outside the door. We slept peacefully, and the guard stood awake, because one of the prisoners might outwit everyone and escape, but we slept. The morning brings longing. We stood or squatted, faceless and shapeless, waiting for the bread box, longing for the night and dreading the dawn, counting the days and cursing the slow passage of time. Minutes added up to hours, hours to days, and 4 short days made up an entire epoch. We cursed the officers, invented all sorts of ways of revenge, and fell so deeply into the bottomless abyss of self-pity that the whole world turned upside down and lost its usual shape. The blankets and the bread box became the most important things in the world. They occupied all our thoughts. At times we lost the ability to think of anything else, enveloped in the darkness of black despair that brings evil. But eventually the morning comes, which brings freedom. Once again there is a guard with a rifle behind you, escorting you to the infirmary and company headquarters. And finally the long-awaited release. The iron door slams shut behind you, and the semi-darkness of the cell, where the prisoners receive only bread and water, and the faceless shadows moving through it are a thing of the past. The visit to the brig was not without a trace. Seemingly only 5 short days, they left a scar in my soul. It left a memory of humiliation that can be shared with all birds that have their wings clipped, with all living creatures in cages, with vagrants in prison. Nevertheless, a man who comes out of the brig where he has been for the first time, if he has the spirit and will to make the best of the trouble, will look back on a few terrible days and smile. And then he'll laugh. He was safe now. He's been through the bread and water cell. When I was released, Hohotun was awaiting summary judgment, and his defense counsel called me as a witness. Runner was also to appear as a witness. On the day of the trial, we were all trembling with fear. Hohotun Tume, because of the gravity of the charge against him, as a result of which he might well be court-martialed, begun. Because his loyalty to Hotun might inadvertently expose his own sins, and I am I, for the same reason multiplied by the fact that I had already been in the brig. We were frightened also because at first sight the court seemed to us a pathetic parody of justice. I say at first sight because its composition and conduct might have made it seem so, though in fact it was no parody, and the conclusion of the court was not so much fair as practical. A jurist could, of course, argue that the Hotchatun trial was a parody. The lawyer could sneer at our friend's defense attorney, a young second lieutenant, even younger than us, fresh from a crash course in law at a New York college, who was destined to become a politician, not a lawyer. A lawyer could snort contemptuously at the conduct of the trial and the judges, who were drawn from a pool of lieutenants and captains who only 2 years before had been students at different colleges. And the most serious question they had to decide was whether to spend their pocket money on books or beer. Such was the trial that was to decide the fate of Hototun. It ended with his demotion from corporal to private and 10 days in the general brig. No one, least of all Cockotun himself, expected such a merciful decision. It is a pity that my memory has begun to fail me, and I cannot describe the trial in detail. I remember how the prosecutor interrupted Hototun's defense counsel when he questioned me about my friendship with the defendant. "This is not relevant to the case," he said sharply. The defense counsel, at first wondering what this phrase, often heard in court, had to do with him. The only person in the room with at least some legal training, displayed an expression of crushing contempt on his face and continued the questioning. The judge, realizing that the defender is legally savvy better than anyone else, overruled the objection. So Hotun was deprived of his chevrons and spent 10 days in the relative comfort of the brig. Unlike me, when he was released, he could only complain about one thing. In the brig, he had fallen in with an officer who enjoyed shaving the hair off the heads of his charges, making them as smooth as his knee. Jehotan, when he was released, gleamed with a completely bald skull, and, showing a vanity unknown to us, wore a cap on it until his luxuriant blonde hair grew back. The military police were surprisingly numerous. We all unanimously hated the black armbands with the white letters. When we boarded the Australian ship Manora, preparing to leave for manoeuvres in Melbourne Bay, the military police were assigned to guard the port gate. The guys with the black armbands became our nightmare. Only a really smart and agile person could slip past them. We all really wanted to go ashore. We hated the ship with all our souls. Even its name seemed extremely unpleasant, even repulsive. We hated the lingering boredom that was the constant companion of our stay on board. What good is dull waiting for manoeuvres to begin? And even if this unhappy occupation is accompanied by such circumstances as tripe and boiled potatoes for breakfast, sleeping in hammocks in the hold, and constant polishing of the endless varnished wooden surfaces of the Manora. One night there was a rumour that the military policeman had been recalled and only civilian guards remained at the gate. Within an hour there were no Marines left on the ship. They climbed over the fence separating the port area from the city, and the bravest went straight through the gate. The elderly civilian guards couldn't hold them anyway. Chuckles, Runner, myself, and another boy from Louisville, a cousin of the gentleman, who was nicknamed Chicken because of his tender age. He was not even 19 at the time. We walked out the gate. It was already becoming known that the civilians didn't give a damn about us. We went into the first restaurant we came across on the way out. The bland food we had been served on Manora was so boring that we were dreaming of traditional Australian steaks and eggs, which were so pleasant to drink with wine or beer. And then there were the jugs of fresh, fat milk and the plates filled with Australian bread. Milky white bread that tasted like cake, thinly sliced and spread with a thick, cheese-like layer of butter. The restaurant was one spacious room surrounded by a gallery or balcony, which was reached by a staircase. At the far end of the room could be seen a door leading to the kitchen. To the left was a small dining room for the privates, in which I noticed a round table and a few hard chairs. We ate our supper and proceeded to libations. Uhotun had managed to call his girlfriend, and she was supposed to come over to see him, but the date wasn't scheduled until an hour later. So we sipped our liquor in peace, as did half a dozen other groups of Marines. Among them was a tall, handsome, dark-skinned guy from Company EE. The company barber, that is, a man who could cut hair a little shorter without disfiguring the wearer. He was visibly drunk. Several Marines were with girls, dancing to tunes from a jukebox. Through the open door the sidewalk was visible, barely illuminated by the dim light falling from the window. It had been drizzling rain all day, and the wet sidewalk glistened slightly. A jeep braked sharply near the open door. It came out of the blue. No one had seen it pull up. Just then the street had been deserted, and now there was a car there. 4 military policemen jumped out of it and ran into the restaurant. We scurried around like frightened sheep. The panic was compounded by the sound of furniture being overturned. Funny, but there were no human voices. Even the girls were silent. I ran toward the stairs leading to the gallery, followed by the police. Running down the corridor, I saw an open door from which light was falling. I ran inside and locked it. Without waiting for the door to burst open, I leapt across the room and into the bathroom, where I saw a half-dressed Australian shaving in front of the mirror, his face covered with soapy foam, a razor in his hand. He was obviously not frightened, but very surprised. "What's the matter, Yank?" he asked as I looked around frantically for a way of escape. "The military police are after me," I replied, breathing heavily. Those you can get away, Yankee. Look, from this window you'll get to the roof. And go, they won't run after you. Come on, Yankee, I'll try to hold them off." I slipped out onto the roof, hearing heavy banging on the door behind me. I crawled cautiously to the edge, moved down, and hung on by my arms. A moment later I heard the excited voices of the policemen, to whom the Australian was saying something. I couldn't make out the words. Then I heard the window open and saw the beams of pocket lights flickering in the darkness. Then the window closed, and there was silence. The edge of the roof I was clinging to was cutting my fingers. Somehow I felt like a few more minutes and my body would tear off and fly downward, my arms still hanging. Pulling my torso back up onto the roof seemed like a Superman's job. And at the same time, I couldn't afford to fall, because the noise of a fall would give away my location to the police. I was afraid to turn my head to see what was going on down there, so I kept hanging, trying to ignore the pain that was becoming unbearable. Finally, I heard the Jeep's engine start, and the car drove away. Only then did I jump off. It looked more like a fall, but that was a small thing. I landed on the street. The RC's windows faced that way. If the cops had bothered to look up, they would have seen me. I hid in the shadows until I was sure none of them were still in ambush. Then I went back into the restaurant. I started drinking again, anxiously waiting for Chuckles, Runner and Chicken to show up. But they were still gone. The other Marines were back, laughing and discussing the details of their escape from the cops. Hey, Company. I asked the guys, including a barber I knew. Have you seen the guys from H Company? Did the cops catch them? I see. The cops didn't catch anybody, they laughed back. They all ran upstairs after you. How the hell did you get away? Hey, I didn't think about leaving. I told them I was in company, and they took pity on me, I answered. Miss Livers, someone responded. SL. Company never backs down. It's in Company H where everyone tries to hide their arse. For a while we continued to exchange insults. A fight was brewing. The only thing that prevented it was that the dark-skinned barber, drunk out of his mind, fell off his chair. The comrades bent down to help him, and just at that moment the police came running into the room again. They came so quickly that there was no escape. I started toward the mess hall, but was intercepted. Where do you think you're going? To get my headdress. Headdress? Please tell me, come with me, boy. The other policemen were trying to get the barber on his feet. His head was hanging like a broken doll. The rest of the valiant E Company slipped away, leaving their senseless comrade and me to be torn apart by the cops. None of the invaders put a hat on the barber's head and, supporting him under his arm, led him to the exit. I turned to the policeman clutching my shoulder. So what about my headgear? Where is it? It's in that room. I need to get it. Okay, but I'm coming with you. I walked leisurely to the door, opened it, stepped over the threshold, then slammed the door sharply behind me, skipped across the room in 2 jumps, flew through another door, and found myself in the kitchen, screaming. Where's the exit here? Following the waitress's gaze, which pointed somewhere in the corner, I swung open another door and found myself in the backyard. I could see a high brick wall with barbed wire on top of it. Hearing the stomping of the policeman running after me, I flew through the space separating me from the wall, jumped up, grabbed the edge, pulled myself up on my arms. There, a little more. Now one leg, the other, I'm almost free. Shot. Son of a bitch, he's shooting at me. Dumping down, I couldn't stand on my feet and fell to my knees. My hands were bleeding badly. I must have torn them on the barbed wire. My clothes were torn, too. But all I could think about was the shot, and I felt a cold rage come over me. But now I had to defend myself from the pack of dogs that had gathered around me as soon as I landed in the alley. They yapped loudly, thus letting the world know exactly where I was. The windows in the houses on either side of me began to light up. I scrambled along the fences, fending off the dogs. A light came on in the house to my left. The door swung open, and a flashlight beam struck me in the back. I crouched down, but I couldn't escape it. Who's there? A woman's voice called out. I'm an American Marine, I answered, thinking it would be foolish to pretend I wasn't here, especially since the dogs had already surrounded me and appeared to be about to attack. I'm being chased by the military police. Come here. And you get out of here, you fucking mongrels. That last one applied to the dogs. The woman chased them away with a bright flashlight, and I was able to slip through the gate. The light of the lantern illuminated my bloody hands. You're hurt. Come on. I'll bandage it. I used to be a nurse. I followed her into the house. She washed the scratches, put disinfectant on them, and bandaged them. I watched her deft, skillful hands in silence. She was a simple woman with a stern, strong-willed face. She looked to be in her mid-50s. She was alone in the house, but it didn't even occur to her to be afraid. Why are you running away from those bloodthirsty bastards? She asked after she finished dressing. They've been chasing me all night. We're aboard the Mayora now, and a lot of us went ashore today. But we don't have leave, and besides, we shouldn't be walking around town in our work clothes. That's what I thought, she smiled. I thought it was odd that you were so casually dressed. You Americans are always so neat. Everything is ironed and polished and shiny. I followed her through the low, dark hallway. The woman acted perfectly calm, as if she was in the habit of rescuing fugitives from the police and bandaging them every night. I stopped behind the curtain separating the hallway from the kitchen. She opened the door. 2 shots rang out like thunder. She slammed the door shut. "Whoa," she said. "They shot one of your comrades." Her voice was perfectly calm, as if she were reporting that it had finally stopped raining, not that a policeman had shot the poor barber. The .45 caliber bullet, I later learned, had pierced his thigh. He was running down the street, and when I opened the door, shots were heard and I saw him fall. Shush, they're close by. I instinctively took a step back, trying to disappear into the darkness. And she gently opened the door again. "Well, that's it," she sighed. "They're gone. Do you hear that? Their car is moving away, and I think your buddy's all right. At least he's alive. They took him away in their car." I moved closer and looked out into the street with a sinking heart. "Do they do that often?" she asked. "No," I growled. "I've never heard of anything like that before." "Did they really shoot him?" "Yes, I saw him fall." "They'll regret it," I promised. "What do you mean?" "I wouldn't want to be that policeman, especially when the shot man's comrades find out who did it. I hope they give him a good beating he'll never forget. To think of shooting at your own people." I thanked the kind woman and slipped out into the street. To my left I could see the road running along the shore and faint rays breaking through the clouds over the water. I walked toward the dock, intending to look for creeper or runner and return aboard the Manora. I was tired of playing hide-and-seek with the military police, which had become too dangerous. I stepped out onto the road, saw the lighted door of the restaurant, and looked around carefully. There were no policemen anywhere to be seen. I crossed the road and walked down the wooden steps to the shore. Sir Hotoun had to be here somewhere with his girlfriend. Dressed like that, he simply had nowhere else to go. The soft sand muffled the sound of my footsteps, so I whistled loudly to avoid bumping into the couple suddenly and startling them. Continuing to whistle, I sat down beside the boat pulled onto the shore. 10 minutes later, Crestfallen emerged from the darkness and sat down next to me. "Where's Hope?" I asked. "She went home." "Come on, we'd better hurry." On our way to the dock, we ran into Chicken. When he saw us, he smiled happily. "Nammed you lucky. I could have sworn the cops had your ass. I almost choked when I saw you scurrying up the stairs. I ran too, but I couldn't help laughing. You know, they got the runner." "The runner?" "That's right. They got him first. I saw it myself." Coco turned laughed, merry. "At last the big gun will be in the brig too." "That's right. Now he'll be a member of our club." We approached the gate in silence. In front of the gate walked an ancient Australian, a relic dressed in a civilian guard uniform. He gestured us toward him and whispered, "Oh, don't even think about it." The officer on duty watches the gate and arrests everyone who enters. We thanked the old man warmly and left for the council. It was decided to climb over the fence. We managed to do it quite quickly, but then we found out that the floating pier was tens of meters away from the shore, and we could reach it only in one of the small dinghies anchored there. Hiding in the shade of the pier, we approached one of the pilings and Hotoun and Chicken crawled deftly up. They moved so noiselessly that I could hear what seemed to me a very loud splash of water hitting the pile. I called softly to them, but there was no answer. For fear of attracting the attention of the sentry, I did not raise my voice again, but tied up the dinghy and followed them. When my head appeared above the wharf, I saw a strange sight. Hotoun and Chicken were standing side by side, with their arms raised high above their heads, and a helmeted sentry was aiming a rifle at them. I wanted to hide, but the sentry had already noticed me. He waved his rifle imperiously, and I joined my comrades, assuming the same posture. Judging by the sentry's demeanor, he was a newcomer, fresh from the States. No veteran would have behaved like that to his comrades. And certainly not a veteran would have thought of threatening his comrades with a weapon. Chuckles spoke conciliatorily to the lad. "Is the rifle loaded?" "Yes." Answered the sentry, watching us warily. "Is the cartridge in the chamber?" "No." We took a breath, and I, who had managed to move closer to him during the conversation, suddenly rushed toward the dark hull of the ship. I expected that the sentry would either not fire or would turn to take aim, giving Hotoun and Chicken an opportunity to knock him down, throw him into the water, or at least run in different directions to give him as much trouble as possible. The sentry, however, was quicker and more savvy than the rest of us. He jumped back to keep Creeper and Chicken in sight, and, slinging his rifle on his shoulder, expended a cartridge. When I heard the distinctive click, I froze. We all froze, staring at the sentry in bewilderment and horror. "Are you crazy, boy? Have you mistaken us for damned Japs? Put your gun down at once." The sentry stared at us for a few seconds with his mouth hanging open in surprise. It seemed that Hohotun's angry words had fallen on fertile soil that the guy didn't even know existed. The look in his eyes changed, and he seemed to see us as completely different people, not the abstract violators he had been ordered to apprehend, but ordinary Marines like himself, soldiers of the same battalion. Confused, he began to lower his rifle, but it was too late. Out of the large dark shadow cast by the ship came the officer on duty. When I saw that it was Lieutenant Ryzak, I involuntarily tensed my stomach muscles, as if I were preparing to take a bullet. The thing is that Ryzak was the most capable, the most respected, and at the same time the most bloodthirsty of our battalion command. He was feared more than anyone else. I stood with my hands in the air and watched him approach, pulling out his pistol as he went and calling for the corporal guard. I had seen him before, though from a distance. He was walking through our positions on Guadalcanal and practicing pulling out a pistol hidden behind his back. He was learning to draw and fire quickly, and quite possibly with the same gun he now held in his hand, the muzzle of which rested against my stomach. He glanced at me from under his helmet, but no emotion was reflected in his confident, impassive face, with its large nose and small, wide-set eyes. "Search them," he ordered, and pressed the gun harder into my long-suffering stomach. "Why do you want to search me?" I asked. "You know me, Lieutenant. I'm not from the 5th column." "Search them," repeated the lieutenant, and the guard obeyed. He was obviously ashamed. "Give us a chance, Lieutenant," said Hohotun, which surprised me immensely. But then I remembered that Trotter had gone all the way from soldier to officer, and I assumed that Hohotun was appealing to him for that reason. "No chance today," said Trotter. His voice was stern and dry. "You should have thought when you ran from ship to shore without leave and without uniforms." He looked at us coldly and said, "Sentry, take a position behind these men and cover them." "Come on, Lieutenant." Hohotun didn't give up hope. "We didn't do anything wrong. The whole 2nd Battalion was on the beach tonight. We were just unlucky you caught us. Hey, you weren't the only ones. I caught a dozen of you trying to get through the gate. I let them all go. But not you. I've seen how much ingenuity you've shown to go unnoticed. You boys are too cunning. If I'd been the sentry, you'd be dead by now." He led us to the Manora, up the gangway, then to the bow of the ship and down the gangway into a hole lit by a single dim electric bulb. It was an arresting room, not a cabin, but a small cubbyhole formed at the junction of the starboard and port sides of the Manora. Near the spars, the ribs of the ship were perfectly visible. It was impossible for one person to turn around here, and even for 3. We were literally shoved into this hole, and when the hatch slammed shut, we saw a sign on the bulkhead that said, "This room is certified to hold 1 sailor of average build." We looked at each other, counted each other, and laughed. Then we fell asleep. Chuckles, as the heaviest lay down on the deck, I on top of him and Chicken on top of me. We woke up feeling that we were at sea. The bow of the ship was going up and then down again. We, lying on top of each other in a tight paw, felt these alternating ups and downs probably better than anyone else. Our cage shuddered along with the movements of the Manora. We rose and fell measuredly, sometimes with dizzying speed, sometimes slowly, smoothly. The abrupt fall, with all the insides rising upward, was most unpleasant, but we felt no discomfort or even distress. The movement of the ship meant that the manoeuvres had begun, the consequence of which, we thought, would be increased employment of our commanders, who would have no time to punish us for the misdeed we had committed. We were proved wrong. And again bread and water. The brig room where we got together with Chicken was lively, as a result of a short court session presided over by the battalion chief of staff. I was deprived of my first-class stripes, which I had just recently received again, fined and sent to bread and water for 10 days. Chicken was punished just as severely, and Hohotun escaped the brig by paying a second time with a pair of corporal's chevrons. At the brig we were greeted with cheers. "Look who's back." "Welcome aboard, friend." It was like a reunion. Almost everyone in the brig had been here before, so everyone knew each other. Even the guards seemed excited. My appearance interrupted the election. It was a regular procedure, the election of the mayor of the brig. It was the most honest and fair election in my memory. The candidates had only two factors to consider: frequency of confinement and length of service. Elections were held whenever the next mayor's term of imprisonment ended at the post. One candidate made a lengthy speech, replete with promises of terrible revenge against officers and innumerable privileges for prisoners. His opponent was our Stump. He was brief. "He has a short sentence," he said contemptuously of his opponent, "and it is only his second time here. He poked himself in the chest. I'm on my fourth tour and have 15 days left." Stump was elected by an absolute majority. "Congratulations, Mr. Mayor," I said, but he didn't have time to reply properly. The bread box had just arrived. Everyone rushed to him, and I did not lag behind. A man quickly gets used to deprivation. Stump poured a flask of water from the tap and broke a large slice of bread in half. "Now I'm going to make a sandwich," he said confidentially. "With what?" I snorted. "With air?" Salt," he replied seriously. "I always make a sandwich with salt." He took a handful of salt from the box, scattered it on one slice of bread, and carefully spread the grains across the length of the slice. Then he covered the salt with a second slice. "Just right," he said dreamily. "That's just the right amount of salt for this." He began to chew, occasionally taking a sip of water from his flask, and he looked so pleased that it seemed sinful. If I didn't remember Stump on Guadalcanal mixing wormy rice with the contents of a random jar of nut butter and happily devouring that indigestible food, I would have thought the fellow was crazy. But that's just the way Stump was. He was always content with what he had and never got discouraged. How can you beat a man like that? That night, our company went on guard duty, and Runner became a sentry in our cell. Although he had been caught by the military police during the Manuora episode, his luck was good and he was released. When it was dark and we were all stretched out on the blankets, Begun took out cigarettes from his pockets and lit a cigarette, one for himself and one for me. Soon the rest of us smoked as well. In the darkness we could see the smouldering lights of the cigarettes. "What about some food?" I asked in a whisper. "Where from?" "The galley's been closed for a while. But the kiosk at the front gate always sells hot dogs." I fell asleep in the happy anticipation of a delicious meal. The jogger woke me up around midnight. He was holding an impressively sized bag filled with food from the kiosk. I woke Chicken. The jogger came out of his cell, and we began to greedily devour the food. What a delicious banquet it was! The coveted hot dogs were spiced with the spices of risk, scented with the sweetest odour of prohibition, and imbued with the nectar of mock punishment. The next night he pleased us with a similarly festive dinner. All this would have been repeated again, but another company was already on guard duty. On the fourth night we were suddenly awakened. "It's him," said an unfamiliar voice, and I was ordered to get up. A similar order was given to Chicken. We were taken outside. Understandably, we feared the worst. But it turned out that we were released. We were taken to the battalion newcomer, who was nicknamed Eloquent for his lengthy and eloquent discourse and very expressive gesticulation. He led us down the corridor to the sergeant major of the battalion, and we were surprised to note that there was life at large. It was only 9 o'clock in the evening, and we had already been asleep for 2 hours. "What happened?" I asked Eloquent. "You were unjustly imprisoned," he answered. "Why?" "Nashishtaba showed too much enthusiasm. He wanted to throw a stone at you, but he chose too big. In a deck trial, you can demote a man or fine him or lock him up, but you can't apply all 3 punishments at once, as was done to you." "Do you mean to say that I'll get my money and stripes back?" Eloquent looked at me with pity. "No, don't even dream of it. The Master Sergeant has already rewritten the papers, and it's all settled for you two." What's the punishment?" "Demotion and a $50 fine, same as before." "What about 4 days confinement on bread and water?" "That didn't happen." Chicken and I stopped, seized with impotent anger. "The new court report says you're punished with a fine and demotion, and that's what it'll say in your papers. There will be no mention of the brig." "It will," I hissed, struggling to control the rage that was spilling over because I won't sign anything else. "Take me back to the brig." and I'll serve out my 10 days. Having uttered this angry tirade, I turned to Chicken. What do you think? Will you go to the brig with me? No, Lucky. Chicken looked at me timidly and ingratiatingly. I don't want to, and why go back when you can stay free? And how can we refuse if the sergeant major tells us to sign the papers? We can't fight the whole world. Those are the words of a reasonable man, Eloquent said importantly. You call that reasonable? I exploded. The damn master sergeant makes a mistake and we have to pay for it. We sat through 4 days we shouldn't have sat through, and we're supposed to forget about it and then sign off on it so the lie becomes official. Is that reasonable? Screw you and your sergeant major. You can tell him to take the papers he wrote with 2 fingers, thumb and forefinger, and on the count of 3 shove them. Okay, relax. You're going to get the entire US Marine Corps excited. You're absolutely right. The master sergeant isn't. But unfortunately, you're the right private, and he's the wrong master sergeant. I couldn't agree with him more. He said it right. A right private doesn't stand a chance against a wrong master sergeant. Don't think I'm not impressed by your fortitude, said Eloquent. And in the Middle Ages it would have been appreciated even more, but personally I advise you to suck it up and sign the papers. Come on, Lucky, said Chicken. Let's sign these stupid papers and find something to eat. I signed the papers while the sergeant-at-arms sat silently at his desk, boring his eyes into me. I signed them in disgust, hating every letter that made up my name. I was released and went straight to the company, where I found out that Eloquent could borrow £1 until the day of the next payday. We took it and slipped away to Richmond, where we ate steaks and eggs without restraint and berated the master sergeant. In Marine Corps terms, Chicken and I didn't serve those 4 days at all, and we never got our paychecks. Let's face it, Lucky, Chicken sighed, chewing another piece of steak with satisfaction. We're walking down a one-way street. Our stay in Melbourne was coming to an end. When are you leaving? The girls asked. No, say you will leave us soon. The people who had invited us to visit told us. They knew. They always knew everything before we did. To me, pleasures were much less. There weren't enough girls. We couldn't drink as much as we wanted. Soon it would all be over. The drought would quickly dry up the rush of pleasure, and we'd be back in the desert. So we tried to drink to our heart's content. At the end of September 1943, we were led from the stadium to the pier and loaded onto ships. We were going back to the war. Crowds of women gathered on the wharf. There must have been men in this multifaceted crowd, but our eyes could see only girls' faces and thin women's hands waving at us. Look at them, Lucky, said the big man. Don't kid yourself. They didn't just come to say goodbye to us. They're not only waving at us, they're waiting for the first boatload of Marines to come into this harbour. Oh, so what? The Totun shrugged his shoulders. If you were them, you'd be doing the same thing. You're just jealous. Damn it, of course, said the big man bitterly. It's just a shame I'm on the wrong boat. And then, as if to emphasize the correctness of the farewell scene and to sum up the great debouching, which was now behind us and receding as the water space between the stern of our ship and the dock widened, the guys on board decided to mark the farewell in their own way. They extracted from their pockets and wallets very balloon-like rubber articles, universally used for contraception, of which there was now no need, and inflated them. The balls of various sizes were then thrown into the water and floated, driven by the wind and bouncing on the waves. Very soon the water space between the pier and our slowly receding transport was covered with a multitude of these white, sausage-like balls. First there were dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. They danced in the wind, bouncing, colliding and flying apart again, frolicking in the water, separating the 2 human camps that were never to meet again. For a long time the hoarse, vulgar shouts of the Marines were heard, answered by the thin voices of the girls, who portrayed grief. They echoed like birds in a forest, performing a strange concert that only they could understand. The distance increased and the balloons were still visible. Hello and goodbye, women of the West. Like all Liberty vessels, our ship was anonymous. I mean, it had a name, of course, but it was completely unmemorable. The kind of word you remember as you say it, and then immediately forget it again. An uncomfortable, dark, ugly, boring ship. It served only to carry us from one place to another like a ferry. There was no interest, no individuality, no adventure. In short, it was nothing. It was the first Liberty-type vessel of our age, but by no means the last. Of the whole unrepresentable family of these marine vehicles, Ho-Ho Toon expressed his opinion as follows. He said, looking with disgust at the crowded decks and listening to the convulsive jerking of the vessel, "This thing must have been made at the end of the week." On Friday night, they gathered a lot of people who had nothing to do in one place and got them properly drunk, and by Sunday night they had riveted this masterpiece together. He waved his hand, showing that his opinion applied not only to our slow beauty, but to the whole long column of transports, most resembling a herd of cows, moving northward from the Australian coast. We ate on deck, and here we had our natural needs met. A canopy was built over the upper deck where the galley was located, and here were the galley toilets. In high winds, it took considerable skill to keep the plates on the tables and the food in our stomachs if the wind was blowing from the side of the galley. We started swallowing atabrine tablets again. When we got our portions in the galley and went out, holding a mug of coffee in one hand and food and cutlery in the other, we were met by the officer on duty and ordered to open our mouths, into which the orderly carefully dropped a yellow pill. "Open your mouth." "You missed asshole?" "Hey, you, watch your food." "Shit. I told you to watch your—" "There's nothing I can do, Lieutenant. The goddamn boat's rocking." "Goddamn you donkeys. You're spilling your coffee. Move it, move it. Hey, you there, come on, what are you looking at? Orderly, pay attention, you're missing too many people. Pay attention, I said. Pay attention." Oh, sorry, sir. It's not too bad a burn, sir. It's not even a second-degree burn, I'm sure. Damn it, corpsman, can you hear me? Just a minute, sir. The rocking's getting worse again. Oh, now it stinks from the latrine, do you smell that? Careful, sir, we're turning left. And so we made our way along the Australian coast, heading for the Great Barrier Reef. The reef was on the starboard side and the coast on the left. It was a natural protective barrier, and we were allowed to smoke on deck at night. No enemy submarine would climb into such a dangerous labyrinth for it. We didn't know where we were going. The only thing we were sure of was that our course lay to the north, which meant back to the war. By this time, the Japanese had already been knocked out of the Solomon Islands and most of New Guinea. We were heading north across the vast expanse of water in Oceania. Our thoughts were mostly occupied with the frighteningly heavy losses of Tarawa. But still, we were veterans, so we did not show fear. But we joked a lot and made the most incredible assumptions about the place where we were being taken and about what conditions awaited us there. No one had any doubts about the latter, however. In short, we spent our time in idle chatter, sitting on the dirty tarpaulin covering the hatches. If that got tiresome, we played word games or made up all sorts of slogans. Who was better? Fool fell asleep. It's rabble. Someone said about the impregnable Japanese fortress on New Britain. Golden Gate, I want to see you, cried another nostalgically, thus expressing a general longing and doubt that we would soon see San Francisco. I wish I could stay on the register by getting on the Gloucesters. Broadcast a third, prophesying gloomily that not everyone would survive at Cape Gloucester, at the far end of New Britain. As for the prospect of an invasion of Korea, the Freudians, of whom there were many in our ranks, could not resist the temptation to rhyme the word Korea with another word for one of the consequences to which Freud's teachings often lead in life. If a person is lazy, deprived of exercise, and also desperately bored, he is very easy to piss off. Even the prospect of eating was annoying, because to do so one had to get up, collect the cutlery, then stand in line, and after the meal such unpleasant procedures as washing dishes and putting them back in their place were inevitable. And during this time, some insolent man might well take a comfortable place on the sunny side of the deck. It was possible to buy sweets in the ship's mess hall, but it was not so easy and annoyed immensely. The thing is that it was necessary to stand in line for at least 3 hours while the sailors were shopping, and when the queue reached us, it often turned out that all the most delicious things had already been taken away, and we were cruelly disappointed. The supply of sweets was always exhausted just as the Marines were about to buy something, and again, as if by the order of some mysterious deity, was replenished every morning, so that the sailors would never be denied anything. We often stood on deck for long periods of time and gazed at the boiling green storms astern. Sometimes, if the bow of the ship was too deep in the water, the stern would lift up, exposing the desperately turning propellers. It seemed as if the propellers were uncomfortable being exposed to the sunlight and wanted to hide themselves in the cool green-blue depths. Looking at the foaming water, you could gradually sink into a pleasant apathy. You didn't need to think or feel, you didn't even need to exist. just merge with the wave and follow, boiling and foaming, the stern of the ship. It was only when the bow of the ship plunged into the water, the stern rose and the endless water disappeared from sight, that the blue sky overhead and the whirring of the propellers brought us back to reality. We were allowed to stay on deck at night, but after we left the protection of the barrier reef, we were forbidden to smoke. There were dark nights that were as safe as the Great Barrier Reef, but there were also starry nights that cast a pale light over the world and illuminated us better than any ship's lights. We were sailing through straits, fringed by the green fringe of jungle, sloping down to the water itself on the hilly islands surrounding us left and right. Somewhere ahead was New Guinea. We found ourselves in the bay unexpectedly. Just at some point the traffic stopped and we started unloading. One of the transports seemed to have run aground about half a mile off our starboard side. "The captain will probably go home now," suggested Horton. "Yes," agreed Runner. "He must be one of those captains that the Merchant Marine Academy turns out when they are 21 years old." But we had no time to pursue the subject further. We were about to disembark. The crew, urged on by the bosun's threatening shouts, were already lowering the boats. We went on deck and, on command, began to climb down the nets hanging on board. The filled dinghies were following towards the shore. We immediately realized that the island was not uninhabited. No houses were visible, but there were people on shore, and someone, probably the local harbour master, was yelling into a megaphone, directing the unloading. There was also a long string of green trucks stretching out on the shore, on which we and our supplies were to be driven inland to the island. Our turn came, and we found ourselves in a dinghy floating towards shore. From shore I noticed a half-submerged fishing schooner about 50 metres offshore and decided to investigate it. I swam over, climbed aboard, and made my way to the bow, which was rising above the water, being about 4.5 metres above the surface of the water. I felt an urgent need to stab and immediately realised this desire. As I was falling, I noticed with horror that a coral reef was about a metre under the water. I tensed up and tried to make a shallow dive, but nevertheless I scraped the coral with my chest and then swam hastily to the shore. When I got out of the water, it turned out that several of the deep scratches were bleeding, so much so that it frightened a local who was nearby. The scratches had been treated with iodine, presumably because it stings more, and then I heard a voice behind. "You got off easy, Lucky. I guess they didn't give you that name for nothing. Does it hurt a lot?" I turned around and saw Father Honesty. Even without seeing him, I knew it was him. No one else in the Marine Corps had that soft, sonorous voice. Father Integrity was our chaplain, the first and only one in the 2nd Battalion. He joined us in Australia. I first noticed him on the second day, when I noticed a crowd of Marines surrounding a man who was much older than the rest of us. They looked at him with such frank respect, bordering on adoration, and the man was so obviously not one of us that it wasn't hard to figure out who he was. "It hurts like hell, Father. I didn't even think about the fact that such words in a conversation with a clergyman could be considered blasphemy. Only profanity was forbidden in the presence of the chaplain. But I was really lucky. Good thing I didn't cut myself. Good thing the cuts aren't too deep." "Yeah, sure, thank God." Father Honesty was in his early 40s, and he was easy on the eyes. That's what the Irish call a black celt. When I looked at him, I saw that during the sea voyage he had tanned quite a lot, having lost the whiteness of skin characteristic of life in civilized conditions. In addition, the excess fat on his waist and thighs, an invariable sign of a sedentary lifestyle, had also begun to disappear. How do you like the islands, Father?" "Oh, it's marvellous," he said, his face brightening. "It's my first time in the jungle." He looked at me like a stranger hesitating whether to ask for help or whether it was better to go without. "Is there anything I can do for you, Father?" "See, perhaps. The fact is, in all the commotion I seem to have been forgotten." "Come with us," I suggested. "We'll take care of you." Would that be the right thing to do? He obviously didn't know what to do. Of course it would. We're often in such a mess. "All right," Father Honesty agreed, and we walked together to the truck. The truck started soon enough, and, after travelling over a series of low hills, brought us to the middle of a field of coupi grass. Here was our new home. This is how men are trained in the Marine Corps. First of all, they must be kept in abominable conditions, like starving animals, and then they will fight better. When they are transferred from one place to another, No effort should be spared to make the process as painful as possible. And before they arrive at their destination, a man should be sent ahead to select the most inconvenient of all possible places. They should eat mostly cold food, use machete as their universal tools, and if the commander has any influence in the heavenly office, he will see to it that it rains constantly. All of the above was accomplished. It was pouring rain, it was quickly getting dark, and a rumor was circulating that there would be no food at all. I looked at Father Honest, with his helmet pulled over his eyes and wrapped in a blanket. He looked very unhappy and somehow looked like a kid who had been given a soccer uniform without learning how to play. "Hey, Playboy," I called out to one of the new scout boys. "Help me set up Father Integrity." Playboy readily agreed, and the two of us began cutting grass with machetes. Soon there was a clearing in the field where we made a bed of grass. Then we cut down some posts in a nearby bush, hammered them into the ground, and pulled Father Honesty's cloak over them. He crawled under this improvised canopy and lay down. Something rustled in the grass bed, and Father Honesty was blown away from it like a wind. When he came to his senses, he smiled guiltily and lay down again. In a moment it was completely dark. "No, don't worry, Father," I said. "We're going to get something to eat." "That would be nice," he admitted. "Where?" "I'll tell you in confession." "You know you can't steal from yourself," laughed Father Honesty. "Of course, we just want to speed up the distribution process a bit." We went out to the road and asked to board an empty truck passing by, returning to the shore. After 1.5 kilometers, we jumped off and waited for the next truck with food to go inland. The light of its headlights seemed very dim through the rain. We climbed into the back of the truck as it slowed down on a rise, drove to our bivouac, dumped a case of tomato juice and baked beans on the ground, and jumped in. We divided the spoils among friends, and then hurried to Father Integrity's shed. He was already asleep. We had to wake him up. "We brought you some food, Father," I said, "but maybe you'd better bless it first." "What?" he mumbled, startled awake. I didn't understand. "Oh," he exclaimed, finally waking up, and even in the darkness you could see how pleased Father was. "Oh," Playboy laughed, and so did I, and we crawled out into the rain again. A couple of poor Catholics who had spent a few blissful months in Australia went to bed, not thinking too much about the 10 Commandments and in the firm belief that they had found redemption in this pious offering of stolen tomato juice and baked beans.